Happy Juneteenth. The first Juneteenth was celebrated by African Americans in Texas on June 19th, 1865. Juneteenth honors the end of slavery. It happened 2.5 years after President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all the slaves. 2.5 years later, on that first Juneteenth day, the enslaved people of Galveston, Texas, finally learned of their freedom. Can you imagine waiting 2.5 years to learn that you and your family and your community are finally free? That is what happened. Finally, Major General Gordon Granger and the Union Army troops marched into Galveston, Texas, to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation and free the last enslaved Black Americans in Texas. Today is the 157th anniversary of African Americans celebrating Juneteenth and Black freedom and justice in the United States. Last year, Juneteenth finally became a national holiday. Juneteenth is a time to reflect on our history, on the long road of justice building that we are on. In our service today, we will offer stories of a few justice-creating ancestors that worked for emancipation. They are a few of the many brave people who did their part to bring more freedom and justice to the world. But we began with Juneteenth for Maisie by Floyd Cooper. Maisie wants to go out to play, but it is too late. It's getting dark, Maisie. It's time to stay inside. Maisie wants a cookie, but it is time for bed. Not now, little one. It's too close to bedtime. Maisie wants to stay up late, but she is too little. Bedtime is the rule, sweet girl. Why so grumpy, Sugar Bear? Asked Dad. I can't go where I want, have what I want, or do what I want, answers Maisie. Well, tomorrow you can have a celebration, says Dad. What are we celebrating, says Maisie. We will celebrate the day your great-great-grandpa Mose crossed into liberty. The day will be celebrated by us and many, many more families on a day we call Juneteenth. And Dad lifts Maisie into his arms. I bet you're tired of hearing no all the time. Great-great-grandpa Mose heard no even more. Grandpa Mose worked in the fields that stretched all the way to sunset. He and the other enslaved people would be bone tired, but they had to keep going. Their enslavers wouldn't let them quit, but as they worked, they thought about freedom. And before they finally went to sleep at night, they prayed about freedom, and they made plans for change and a better future. Some slaves ran north to freedom, following a bright star in the sky. They sweat, they bled, and they cried those tears, and they were quieted by a single proclamation from a brave president. Grandpa Mose, he heard that proclamation, read from a balcony of a hotel on a warm day in Galveston, Texas. Grandpa Mose heard nothing but cheers, saw nothing but happiness, felt nothing but pride shared by all those around him. The cheers, and then the dancing came, and the dancing, and then the celebration came, and it went on and on into the night. Grandpa Mose and the others had found freedom. They continued to work, but this time they were paid for their hard work. And so they worked, and they saved, and they never forgot the moment they heard, the moment that changed their lives forever. But things weren't perfect. Black people still struggled to stand shoulder to shoulder with white people. They still weren't treated as equals. It wasn't easy, but they never gave up. And every year on Juneteenth, we remember. They marched for jobs, they lobbied for schools and the right to vote, they shouted for opportunity, and every year on Juneteenth, they celebrated and they remembered. They learned and they grew. They forgave, they excelled and achieved. They became heroes. So now, sweet Maisie, it is your turn to celebrate. just like great-great-grandpa Moe's. It's your turn, Maisie, to eat some barbecue and drink some strawberry pop. It is your turn to celebrate and to remember. The end.
Good morning, First Church. This is a flag, a Juneteenth Day flag, that Reverend Kimberly and the children in religious education and I made last year. So happy Juneteenth, Freedom and Jubilee Day. A long time ago, when I was a little girl in my hometown of Detroit, my family took one of our summer road trips to Virginia, where my father's people were from. During this particular trip, my mother was insistent that we visit one of the natural wonders of the United States, the Natural Bridge. But I was lobbying to go to beaches in North Carolina, which were only 30 miles south of Virginia, of where we were going. But my father, he said an emphatic no. He never, ever wanted to go south of Virginia because places further south were more likely to exclude Negroes from equally doing the same things as white people, like going to the same beaches, or the same school, or swimming in the same swimming pool, or using the same public restrooms. And so, although it was not as woke or aware of racial equality as Detroit, my parents felt that Virginia was generally okay. Well, the Natural Bridge turned out to be a truly magnificent sight to see. I was about 10 then, and my brother was 5, and before we got back on the road, our parents told us to go to the bathroom. And then I saw that there were 2 restrooms for women and girls, one with a sign that read, "Whites only," and one with a sign that read, "Colored only." So naturally, I went to the colored toilets. My reasoning, my thinking was that surely the toilet seats would be colorful in pastels of violets and blues and pinks and yellow. And I opened the door of the toilet stall, and much to my surprise and chagrin, the seats were black and broken, and the whole bathroom was dirty. So I decided to go to the whites-only bathroom, thinking that at least the toilets would be the color white and not broken. As soon as I walked in, 2 white women, whose names might have been Karen, with tight lips and clenched fists, yelled at me, "Get out of here, you pickaninny," which is a derogatory term for black children. "The toilets for your kind are over there." I ran out as fast as I could, totally confused and crying hysterically. My parents scooped up my brother and me, shoved us in the car, and left the Natural Bridge State Park in a big, big hurry. On the way to my grandfather's house, they explained the dynamics of what had just happened. My brother looked totally bewildered, and me, I was really, really, really mad. That was my first experience with racism and prejudice. That memory has stayed with me until this day. And it happened 100 years after Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And we as a nation are still struggling with the intent of that important freedom document that freed the enslaved. In the early years of the Civil War, the deeply troubling question for President Abraham Lincoln was, if he pushed for freeing the enslaved, would it work out or would it be a disaster? Could the enslaved learn to read and write and do math and be self-sustaining? At the start of the war in 1861, when shots were first fired by the Confederates at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, the Union Navy retaliated and captured Port Royal Sound just to the south. The plantation owners fled and abandoned all of their property, including the people that they had enslaved. So President Lincoln and his advisor saw an opportunity and decided to conduct an experiment to determine the likelihood of emancipation succeeding. Lincoln made a clarion call to teachers and other abolitionists in the North to come to St. Helena Island, South Carolina, and participate in the Port Royal experiment, an educational effort that would help Lincoln figure out the viability of emancipation nationwide. Enter Laura Town, abolitionist, revolutionary, a Unitarian. During our road trip this past winter, my husband Jack and I came to know and learn about Laura Town. She was a member of the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia. It was pastored by the Reverend William Furness, whose sermons on the evils of slavery angered many wealthy members of his church, and many left the congregation. Among those who stayed was a woman in her early 30s, Laura Matilda Town. With the support of the Unitarians and Quakers, she answered President Lincoln's call, leaving the comforts of her life in Philadelphia and boarding a ship for St. Helena Island, South Carolina. When she got there, she found 6,000 people who had known no other life than one of bondage. Laura began a school, first in her home, and then eventually in a building she had shipped in pieces from Philadelphia. She named it the Penn School in honor of William Penn and Pennsylvania's Freedmen's Society, which funded the first years of the school. Within months of Laura Town's arrival, a Quaker woman, Ellen Murray, described in Town's diary as a lifelong intimate friend, came to work at her side, and together they built the school into the center of the community of the Sea Islands. Town became a bridge between the government and the Black people of the islands, often as an advocate for their needs and wages, and eventually making it possible for them to own the land they had worked on all their lives. When Jack and I visited the Penn Center, we met people whose parents or grandparents were educated at the Penn School. And it is still a place of community, and it is now a national landmark designated by President Barack Obama. After her death, Laura Town remains the heroine and superhero of the Penn Center's inception. In fact, it's her work that is attributed to its history and longevity. And as an aside, it was at the Penn Center that Martin Luther King first penned his first draft of I Have a Dream speech. One more thing about Ms. Laura Town. As I read her diaries and letters, this book, sometimes I became really annoyed with her because she called blacks she was working with darkies and pickaninnies. Derogatory, like, come on, Laura. But by the second half of her writings, she stopped using those terms and referred to them with respect as the people. The people. So I have to give Miss Laura Town her props. She became aware, she became informed, she became awakened. Laura Town became woke. She exemplifies our Unitarian values. She nurtured the spirit, engaged the mind, and was inspired to action. So one moral of this story is, amid present-day obstacles to justice and freedom, such as racism and book banning and LGBTQ bashing and restrictions on voting rights and abortion, it is never, ever too late for us to be aware, to get informed, to be awakened, and like Ms. Laura Matilda Town, become woke.
It is not the light that we need, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born in Maryland in 1818. However, there is no way of knowing his exact birth date, as it was not common practice to record such information for enslaved people at that time. Douglass acknowledged as much when he said, "I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it." Douglass's mother was named Harriet Bailey. It is assumed that his father was the white man to whom his mother was enslaved. Shortly after Douglass was born, his mother was sent off to work at a nearby plantation, and she was forbidden to leave that plantation for any reason. However, in the darkness of the night, she would risk danger and sneak out and walk many miles to come visit her son. She would stay and comfort Frederick until he had fallen asleep. She would always be gone the next morning by the time he awakened. When Frederick was a bit older, he was sent to live with a couple in Baltimore. There, the mistress of the house, Sophia Auld, began to teach Douglass how to read. She was eventually forbidden to do so by her husband because of his fear that Douglass would not be of any use as a slave if he became educated. However, Douglass was persistent in learning to read and write. He managed to find other children and adults to teach him. He also seized every opportunity to find books, articles, and newspapers so that he may teach himself as well. In September 1838, Douglass escaped from slavery by boarding a train to New York disguised as a sailor. He used borrowed documents of a freed sailor, and he had the help of a freed woman named Anna Murray, whom he married within days of his escape. Although Frederick made it to freedom, he endured the constant threat of being caught in the North and returned to slavery in the South. In college, I researched and wrote a paper about the life and work of Frederick Douglass, and it was surprising to me that he was reluctant to even get involved with anti-slavery work. To me, it seemed as if he was always vested and ready to take on the establishment and was very adept and competent in doing so. But as he once wrote, abolition work was a severe cross, and I took it up reluctantly. Then shortly after he had delivered one of his first speeches at an anti-slavery convention in 1841, he reported that he felt a degree of freedom and that he found his vocation, his calling. In 1845, Douglass wrote a book about his life as a slave, which helped him become an even more important figure in anti-slavery and abolitionist movements. Douglass wrote and published 3 versions of his autobiography, as well as a short novel called The Heroic Slave, and he published at least 4 African-American newspapers. I have a great admiration and appreciation for Douglass and his oratory skills, his many writings, and his persistent pursuit of social and economic justice for formerly enslaved people. During the push to end slavery, Douglass had a complicated relationship with President Abraham Lincoln. He supported Lincoln as a candidate. Then he was disappointed that Lincoln did not do enough to end slavery and that Lincoln did not think that white Americans and free black Americans could live in harmony. Douglass publicly criticized some of Lincoln's actions, but also respected him when he did the right thing, especially the Emancipation Proclamation, about the legal end of slavery. In a speech on the 20th anniversary of the proclamation, Douglass called Lincoln the greatest statesman that ever presided over the destinies of this republic. In that same speech, Douglass spoke to what he referred to as the half and half state of conditions for African Americans that resulted from the proclamation. Black people were no longer slaves, but they did not enjoy the same level of freedom as white Americans. And Douglass said that as long as this inequality goes on, there will be need for discussion and change, something I found to still be relevant and applicable in today's world. In the conclusion of his anniversary speech, Douglass continues to explore the question, what is to be the future of the colored people of this country? He rejects the idea promoted by some leaders at that time that Black Americans should move to Africa. Africa, he says, is too far off, even if we desire to go there, which we do not. He worries that African Americans might continue to face lives of poverty, disease, and death if they remained separated from the rest of American life. Douglass says that unification for us is life, separation is death. Douglass believed that he had already seen progress toward greater unity and that the American people, even with their prejudice, have good qualities as well. They easily adapt themselves to inevitable conditions, he said, and all their tendency is to progress, enlightenment, and to the universal. Despite all he had been through, Frederick Douglass still had faith in humanity, a faith that inspires us to this day.
The words emancipation and proclamation are big words, and they're big words that we don't use every day. But they're words with clear and strong meanings. Emancipation means being set free, and a proclamation is the bold sharing of good news. In the case of the Emancipation Proclamation, the good news, this very good news, was that no one in this country could be enslaved anymore. And Juneteenth means that on a summer day a long time ago, news of freedom finally reached everyone everywhere in the United States. Good news indeed. And there is so much that this long story of the Emancipation Proclamation can teach us. The story of emancipation teaches us that big change doesn't happen overnight. We heard earlier how long Frederick Douglass worked to end slavery. He worked for decades. For those of us who have always known slavery as horribly wrong from the first moment we heard of it, decades sounds like forever. But sometimes when we work for change, we have to be patient as we do the long, hard work. The story of emancipation also teaches us that big change never comes about because of just one person. Frederick Douglass was really important, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. Abraham Lincoln didn't do it alone. It took generations of people, countless numbers of dedicated people, to end slavery. It took many voices speaking up separately and together to make it happen, and those people made lots of small changes along the way. And the story of emancipation teaches us that sometimes you can't wait for everything to be just right before you act. Sometimes working for liberation comes at an inconvenient time in our lives. Sometimes we don't know whether our actions will succeed or not. Sometimes doing what is right and doing what is legal are not the same thing. I want to tell a couple of short stories that illustrate these lessons of the Emancipation Proclamation. First, I want to talk about a minister, a Unitarian minister, who worked for this very church you are sitting in right now. This particular church building did not yet exist, but this congregation did. And in 1856, this church welcomed a minister named the Reverend N.A. Staples. Those initials stood for the name Nahor Augustus. We're just going to call him Reverend Staples. Reverend Staples came here at a time when Milwaukee was booming, and so was the church. But even though the people around him were doing well, Reverend Staples couldn't stop thinking about people who were far away and suffering, people who were enslaved. Before the Civil War, it was radical to loudly oppose slavery, even in the North. But Reverend Staples opposed it loudly, and his views attracted attention. One newspaper said that one of his anti-slavery sermons startled Milwaukee like a fire bell ringing in the night. There are no greater opposites than freedom and slavery, he preached. And he did not think that good people could sit quietly and do nothing while the horrors of slavery continued. In this great conflict, we must all take part, he said, asking his congregation to do all in your power to drive this source of all evil from our midst. As happened in Philadelphia with Laura Town's minister, some members quit this church because they didn't agree with ending slavery. But Reverend Staples didn't stop speaking his mind. In fact, he was so passionately opposed to slavery that he joined the Union Army as a chaplain, so he could minister to soldiers from Wisconsin fighting for freedom in the Civil War. His military service was not good for his health. In fact, Reverend Staples did not live to see that first Juneteenth day. But he remained true to his beliefs all of his short life, and he helped in a small but important way to move public opinion forward toward freedom and justice. But sometimes you can't wait for public opinion to change, or even laws to change. Sometimes you just have to go ahead and do the right thing. And that's what the story of Harriet Tubman teaches us. Like Frederick Douglass, she was born into slavery in Maryland and never knew her exact birthday. Is there anything more dehumanizing to not even have a birthday? She suffered terrible violence while enslaved. And then when she was in her late 20s, she escaped, making her way north to freedom in Pennsylvania, helped by a network of people who called themselves the Underground Railroad. It wasn't literally underground, but it was kept out of view. And it wasn't actually a railroad, but it had stations along the way. After Harriet Tubman got free, she took on the huge risk of going back south at least a dozen times over a 10-year period to help other people escape. Harriet Tubman didn't wait for emancipation to become the law of the land. She went and took people to freedom. And she worked with Frederick Douglass to spread the message that all people deserve to be free. As good as it was, the Emancipation Proclamation did not fix everything. As our story about Laura Town shows, there was a lot of work to be done to help former slaves thrive in their newfound freedom, and success was not guaranteed. And as Frederick Douglass mentioned in his speeches after the Civil War, emancipation left the formerly enslaved only half free. There were still many obstacles back then to true freedom, and there are still many obstacles today that keep African Americans and all people from true equality. There are even versions of the Underground Railroad operating right now, today, in the United States. Instead of helping people get out of slavery, they're helping women travel to states to get the health care they need. Or they're helping trans people move to places where they can be more fully themselves. So the work of freedom is ongoing. That's why we stay clear about what our values are and strive to live those values in our lives. That's why we try to keep our eye on the big picture and the long term when things get slow or difficult, and to turn to history for perspective and inspiration. That's why we speak up here in church and in the world to be what Frederick Douglass called the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. And that's why we do the work of freedom and justice together in community, for mutual support and for celebration whenever the world moves forward. May we keep at it, stick together, and be creators of good news. May it be so, and amen.